I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Jeremy Carl.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, per usual, we have a packed lineup for you this week. Ben is going to talk about the Senate report on the Secret Service failures in the light of two failed assassination attempts, fortunately failed on Donald Trump. I'm going to talk about the escalation potential in the Middle East. We now have an exchange, hostile exchanges between, obviously, between Israel and Hezbollah in the north. We're then going to talk about Kamala's media strategy and whether or not it's working, including her debate challenges, and that's Amber. And then finally, Jeremy is going to wrap us up with some trends about how young men are more Christian and more religious than young women, which is a bit of a reversal from recent times, I believe, but he'll dive more into all of that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thanks, Inez. And I guess, interestingly, this joint report put out by the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on Permanent Investigations, which is bipartisan, presents a scathing picture of the Secret Service's beyond catastrophic failures, beyond gross negligence, probably criminal negligence associated with the July 13th failed assassination attempt in Butler. So the headline sort of takeaway from the report that was put forth is that there were Secret Service, quote, failures in planning, communication, security, and allocation of resources for that event that were foreseeable, preventable, and directly related to the events resulting in the assassination attempt that day. The committee also finds that siloed communications and coordination problems between federal, state, and local law enforcement officials remain unaddressed and were a contributing factor to the failures. So some of the failures that are highlighted in the report, which aren't necessarily new, but are worth emphasizing, and it's helpful that the report catalogs them in one place. So the Secret Service denied requests for counter unmanned aircraft systems capabilities, that is, drones. They also denied drone flight restrictions. And remember, Crooks was able to fly a drone around the site to scatter it out in advance, and a counter assault team liaison as well. Advance agents didn't request surveillance for the outer perimeter of the event, including the AGR building where Crooks took his shots. Secret Service agents were notified 27 minutes before the shooting of a suspicious person with a rangefinder around the AGR building, yet they didn't act fast enough. Advanced planners denied individual responsibility for planning or security failures and deflected blame. No one individual was responsible for approving the plans in their telling. So in other words, if no one is responsible and there are 50 irresponsible people, you can't pin it on anyone and you're protected, essentially. Secret Service personnel, including its counter-sniper team leader, never entered that AGR building or went on the roof prior to the shooting. There were no specific plans Secret Service provided to state or local partners regarding covering that building, despite the fact that local law enforcement had raised concerns about the lack of security coverage there in advance. And all of this occurred even though counter-snipers had been sent to the rally in response to a credible intelligence threat that day. But Crooks was supposedly unknown to the FBI before the attempt, according to the report. Last but not least, federal agencies haven't come close to fully complying with this joint inquiry. So I would note a couple other points, sort of points of omission in this report. One being that it's not clear that anyone has been fired as a consequence of what happened. But second of all, that the focus on the inconceivable cascading of catastrophic failures that occurred, which deserves, obviously, merits and demands the focus of Congress and the American people, because it seems pretty clear that the Biden-Harris administration can't or won't adequately defend Donald Trump or other high-value targets for that matter. But it distracts also, again, from the story about Crooks, the official narrative about which I've always held seems kind of suspect, and in some ways focusing on the purported failures of the Secret Service, which again defy belief. I think in some ways obscure focus from the issue of Crooks and all the bizarre aspects of the real non-story and non-investigation of what exactly transpired there. So with that, I turn it over to the group. What do you make of this report? Do you think that our high value targets are actually going to be safe less than 2 months out from election day? And what do you make of my theory that this distracts from crooks and that there's probably a purpose behind that?
I think there's a lot more about Ryan Ruth to investigate as well. I mean, we just found out that his son was arrested for possession of child pornography, which they discovered when they executed a search warrant against his father. And then Ruth's wife, according to a memo from Gates's office, was employed by a firm that had business with the Department of Defense and was explicitly helping to fundraise for his efforts to go to Ukraine and try to recruit former Afghan fighters to fight on behalf of the Ukrainian military. So I think both of the attempted assassins are very fishy, and there's a lot of unanswered questions separate from the Secret Service failures. But this report obviously is very jarring. It was so unbelievably poor on the Secret Service's behalf, their behavior, that this was a bipartisan condemnation, which we don't get many of those in Congress unless it's related to foreign funding and pretty much anything else that runs counter to the American people's wishes. But yes, there's so many threads worth tugging on in both of these assassination attempts that have really just been papered over by people angry at the Secret Service for legitimate reasons. But I think you're right, Ben, that this is very much a distraction from people trying to figure out the real motivations of the shooters. I mean, it's been sort of rejiggered now for us to believe that Crooks was willing to assassinate either Trump or Biden because he had searched for both of them prior to the Butler, PA rally. But we know that he started searching for Trump some 3 to 6 months prior before he ever entered Joe Biden's events into a Google search bar, which obviously, to any rational person would bring up the obvious idea that Trump was the primary target. So I certainly hope that we don't lose sight of all of those fact patterns.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that we know so little about Crooks. I think with Ruth, there was more that was immediately put out. That at least we have more, as Amber said, those threads to tug. With Crooks, there is, I mean, there was a wipeout on anything. They did wipe us up. If he had social media, it's mostly wiped now, right? Like there's very little in terms of the public investigation that it has been able to turn up, which I assume is not the case internally, but they haven't released anything probably for their own purposes. So to that extent, I agree with you. I think the Secret Service stuff is a big deal in the sense that it's not only obviously because of the consequences, but because it's yet another demonstration of nothing working in the country, even at the highest levels where we assume, quote unquote, the adults are in charge, right? They aren't. And other considerations, and this is actually not a conspiratorial point, other considerations are top of mind rather than competence in executing the job. And we're seeing that for sure in military trainings. We're seeing that in exactly in those things where we would hope that all of the, pardon my French, all of the BS would go to one side, that we observe in all aspects of life, both private and public in America. Increasingly what we're seeing is behind the scenes, that's not happening, even in those cases where it's most important for it to happen. And you would think like all reasonable people be like, okay, let's put some of this stuff to the side. Let's put ideological considerations to the side. Let's put, racial considerations to the side, DEI, all of that stuff. That isn't happening. And other priorities, political priorities, are taking precedence over basic competence. So that's really what I say. I'm not implying that the only incompetence found in this report is related to ideology, but they're intertwined together. And that is itself a huge problem. I mean, what did you list, Ben? I remember 3 out of 4 of the words you used, but like planning, security, allocation, and I can't remember. So there were errors in planning.
Communications. Kind of important.
Yeah. Like security and allocation. That pretty much sums up the job of the Secret Service, right? And as you say, yes, there was a resignation. There were no firings. There's not going to be like a massive overhaul of the Secret Service because of this. I mean, I'd love to be wrong about that, but I doubt it. Unless we have a change of leadership, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a massive overhaul of that requires and restores competence in an agency with one job, right? One very, very important job.
Yeah, I join Inez here in the sort of anti-conspiracy caucus, which I seem to frequently be a sort of minority member in, often on the right. And that, and by the fact that I'm skeptical about conspiracies actually doesn't mean that I actually, in some ways, it's worse, right? And for just the way reasons that Inez very nicely laid out, which is even in these areas where they actually are trying to do something functional, our government's simply incapable of it now. We've just reached that level of incapability, where just things are not working. Just gross incompetence on the part of the Secret Service, and again, a lack of accountability for that incompetence anywhere in the system. And I think for a variety of self-interested reasons, even the Democrats would kind of like to see this work a little bit better, but it's just we're not capable as a government at this point of doing it. Now, at the same time, and I think particularly with Ruth, I mean, obviously the first attempted assassin, motivations are a little more publicly opaque right now, and I'm interested in those. But I'm actually interested to the degree to which our greatest ally, Ukraine, whose fingerprints indirectly are all over this second attempted assassin's kind of resume. And it's not that nobody's mentioned it, but we're just kind of like, let's have Zelensky go sign a shell, in Pennsylvania photo op, and nobody seems to be asking any serious questions about that. Again, I don't think, because I'm sort of anti-conspiratorial, you wouldn't choose these sorts of guys as your secret agent if you're an actual foreign government. They're just too clownish. They're too amateurish. But at the same time, the fact that nobody's asking these broader political questions about motivation in a serious way, and Ben, you did point out that these Secret Service failures, in some ways, that conversation is a distraction. So it's a concern, and we need to fix. It's one of many things we need to fix about this.
Well, one foreign actor that has been brought up, and I know Ben has brought it up in the last couple of weeks, is Iran, that apparently does have pretty reported on by our intelligence service, for whatever that's worth, designs on Donald Trump's life. Speaking of Iran, we're going to go ahead and transition to the Middle East. Of course, last week we covered the pager and beeper operation from Israel against Hezbollah. That was, I think, by any definition, a massive success, followed up by multiple follow-up. So there was the beeper explosions, pager explosions, then walkie-talkies, second round of it. And we know a little bit more than we did last week. It looks like this was a buy, right? It looks like there was a front company essentially that sold regular electronics to a few regular customers, but sold special electronics to Hezbollah. And following up, there was also a strike on senior leadership when they gathered in a warehouse of Hezbollah. So this, as we said last week, potentially an indication of a wider war in the region, right? If you wanted to soften the ground before starting a major ground war to the north, for example, that would make sense, right? To throw your enemy into chaos, to hamper their communications. So the hampering of the communications has happened, and there have been very aggressive or escalated strikes from Israel. I do want to make it clear that's in response to massive escalation since October 7th and October 8th from Hezbollah. The entire northern part of Israel has been evacuated for months and months and months. Reminder, Israel is a small country, 10 million people, I believe. So, disrupting a huge part of the country we talk a lot about refugees, and I think I mentioned this last week. We have a substantial, when we were talking about a couple 100,000 people who are displaced within a country of 10 million, like that's a huge, it's a huge burden for the economy and society to bear. And there have been basically nonstop strikes from Hezbollah. Interestingly, since these hits, yes, there has been an uptick in strikes from the north towards, of course, nobody talks about civilian targets, right? Indiscriminate rocket strikes to civilian targets in Israel. But I wonder at this point, and I'm really curious what the rest of you think. I think actually it seems at least a real possibility that the effectiveness of the Israeli operations in terms of taking out Hezbollah command structure um, may very well save the region at this point. I mean, knock on wood, from a much broader war, because it seems to me that it is, maybe it's because Hezbollah is holding back, and Iran has yet to make that decision. But as of now, it doesn't seem to me that Hezbollah has the capabilities, that those capabilities might have been so damaged by a combination of Israeli intelligence operations and now heavy strikes, that we may actually avoid the possibility of a wider war in the region, which of course would not only be good for Israel, good for people living in the region generally, but also good for the United States, which would prefer obviously not to be. And every time the war gets bigger, the chances that the U.S. will be involved grows. So I don't know what all of you guys think. I mean, these operations, aside from just the basic the baseline, that these operations seem to have been extremely successful in dismantling in a very important way the capabilities of Hezbollah, unless they have something that they're just holding back right now. Because what's happening right now, from what I can tell, and I'm not a military expert, is not, it's stepped up, but it's not the like true conflagration that people feared in the region, looking over at it right now. So curious what you guys all think about that. Okay, somebody has to jump in first. So Jeremy, you're unmuted, so I'm putting you on this as moderator.
Okay, you're gonna put me on the spot. Well, so I wanted to wait because I sort of had an interesting follow-on take from it. I don't feel really qualified to talk, other than to say, yes, I would agree with you that it seems to be really successful in the short term in disrupting Hezbollah's capability, which is kind of intuitive in a certain way, because you sort of look at it and it's like, okay, you didn't trust your cell phones already. Now you don't trust your pagers, you don't trust your walkie-talkies. And oh, by the way, when you meet in person, we're going to blow you up. So you've got to think that there are some pretty fundamental disruptions in capability that may last for some time. What I'm actually interested in is the follow-on, I mean, partially in terms of like whatever lines might have been crossed in terms of this type of operation, but I'm more interested in just the practical element of what this might mean in terms of our own, in America, reshoring certain technology capabilities. Right now, we're letting China and wherever else, sort of manufacture the iPhones and everything else that we've got in our pockets. And while I wouldn't anticipate that a country like China is going to actually sort of put explosives in everybody's iPhones, I think it just shows the real danger that a determined actor can cause in kind of electronics manufacture that we don't control. And that strikes me as a really big national security question for America that is now front and center in a way that I think before this kind of spectacular operation, it might not have been.
I think that's a reasonable kind of tertiary point to make. Obviously, during the Trump administration, there was a review of military supply chains, which essentially found just unfathomable vulnerabilities in the way of needing components from a whole slew of countries for essential weapons and related technologies, obviously including China as well. Should go without saying, you shouldn't have to be reliant upon your worst potential enemies to defend and protect yourself. This obviously extends way beyond the military sphere to medicine and plenty of other areas as well. So in some ways, I think this is a reminder that you have to have an independent capacity to produce necessities, strategic necessities, and that it obviously includes communications devices. I've argued also during the pendency of Israel's war against Hamas and beyond that because of the reliance on America, among others, it's created a situation where Israel's defenses are predicated on what America will permit or not permit. And I don't think ultimately that's in America's national interest. I also don't think that's in Israel's national interest. And we've seen Israel actually start to try and redevelop a domestic capacity to manufacture military hardware. So I think all around, to go to the NatCon point, nations ought to have independent capacities to defend themselves, to supply themselves, and it ends up being better off for all parties involved when they are truly independent and can make the best decisions in their national interests as their leaders see fit. I guess on the
before you move to the second point, Ben,
yep.
one sentence, we should all be afraid of that because the entire West is in that situation. It's not Israel. It in some ways it's more explainable in Israel because again, it's a very small country, and if you devote a certain part of your economy and workforce to this, it's not going to something else, and it's a small, small batch of people, and you're ultimately talking about at the end of the day. But like the U.S. has no capability to manufacture at the scale we would need to for a major war, and not only that, it appears our allies don't have the capability. Like most of Europe does not have the capability. I mean, it really is starting to look like most of the West does not have the capabilities to manufacture the necessities for a major war. And that should terrify everybody. Sorry. That's just like I know that's my hobby horse on this, but every time one of these topics comes up, if we cannot manufacture enough to keep up with these two wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, regardless of what one thinks about American involvement in either, if we can't do that, we can't keep up with a great power war. Not even close.
Amber, feel free to jump in. I can cabin my other remarks maybe to parting shots.
I don't have much to add except that this is just the latest reminder of the Biden administration's really horrible idea to appease Iran in the hopes that this would tamp down escalation and tension in the Middle East, and actually makes it worse because you give them money and freedom to fund all of these terrorist organizations and create these proxy conflicts. And then finally, on Ben's point about the problem of so many of our allies being dependent on us for military capabilities, and as your point as well, I remember Vivek Ramaswamy said this during one of the early presidential debates, or maybe it was an interview, where he talked about the fact that if we truly value Israel as an ally, then we should move towards allowing them the independence to bolster their own security and not be so reliant on the US. And everyone said that he was crazy. And I think he was more prescient than people gave him credit for.
And we're going to go ahead and return it to you, Amber, to talk about Kamala's media strategy as well, and her campaign strategy, which in many cases are one and the same anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So Kamala has announced that she is going to give her second big interview with a major mainstream media outlet. And this one is going to be with MSNBC's Stephanie Ruhle, who coincidentally, just this past week was on Bill Maher arguing against the idea that Kamala Harris should be giving tough interviews to the media and having to answer difficult questions about her policy proposals. And expecting her to do so is like living in nirvana. So there were some amazing memes in response to this. Stephanie Ruhle, Kamala shouldn't have to give tough interviews. Kamala, hey, would you like to interview me? I mean, it just really writes itself. Of course, her first big interview was with CNN with Dana Bash, where she was really allowed to gloss over this massive transformation in policy that she's supposedly undergone in her 50s between 2019 and 2024. Her running mate was helpfully included in that, where he was able to answer this one time for his stolen valor, multiple instances of stolen valor, and able to get away with saying that it was just because he has bad grammar and because he talks like Americans do. So at this point, it's pretty clear that the Kamala campaign is just trying to speed run through the election without having to really explain anything in detail. She's been recycling responses over and over again when asked about policy flip-flops on the so-called opportunity economy plan. She has repeatedly repeated the fact that she is a middle-class kid. When asked about her border policy and whether she supports certain things she did in 2019 in regards to decriminalization of illegal immigration or building the wall, or anything outside of the so-called bipartisan border bill that she's now backing, her response is just to say that when she was a prosecutor, she was going after transnational gangs and she believes in border security. So it's all of these platitudes without any real specifics. But she is supposed to apparently release an 80-page economic policy document this week, which we'll be able to look at and see if there's anything more inane than putting price controls on grocery stores. But I'm just curious if you all think this is working, because there's a poll that sampled voters on who they trust more on the economy. And back in June, Trump was ahead of Biden by 20 points on that issue. And the same poll found that he was only ahead of Kamala Harris by 9 points, despite her, of course, being a part of the administration that is to blame for the horrible economy, which could tank, by the way, by the time the election rolls around, based on some kind of troubling signs that we've been seeing. But the polls are still very tight, despite her being sort of a phantom candidate. I wonder if the strategy is not to just allow voters to sort of project their own desires onto Kamala. We saw the progressives do this with the Palestinian issue, despite her explicitly saying that she would continue Biden administration policy on the Israel-Hamas war. Is that a legitimate strategy, and do you think that it could work heading into November?
I absolutely think it's a legitimate strategy, and I think it has a decent chance of working. I've always been in the camp that this is going to be a close election one way or the other. I didn't actually believe, even when Biden was at the top of the ticket, that there would be a blowout. I think, one, we're divided, and two, there's a lot that the regime can do to make it a close election, right? Even if, and the structure of this race has very much been the regime versus Donald Trump. And like, it's essentially a fill in the blank name. That being said, I think we would be silly to underestimate how, that being a legitimate campaign strategy, it seems to have worked to keep her relatively close in the polls so far. Ben blackpills us every week by reminding us that if it's close, there may be a loss for voting rules purposes. So, I mean, I think this is probably, not only is it a legitimate strategy, I think it's probably the best strategy that they have. In part because Kamala is not very good, and she keeps reminding us when she does do media, like that Oprah interview, that she's not very good on campaigning on her own behalf. I do think the bump has kind of petered out from the media. There's only so much they can do to pump her up without giving any of those specifics. But and maybe we can get back to the question of debating. This is why I guess I go against went against Will last week, and go against Kamala's campaign now in terms of whether they think the debate will help them. Obviously, they think it will, and I think she did get a small bump from this last one, but I just don't think there's any other venue the media is going to permit a discussion of her record on. And to the extent that it's important to disabuse people of some of those projections that they have, the idea that they've been fed by the media, by the Kamala campaign itself, that she is, that her positions are, one, inscrutable, and two, they're really leaning in to just straight lying about her entire record and everything she's said and done. Not just in the last 4 years, but in the last, her entire political career. And I just don't see that breaking through without a major point like a debate. Now, maybe Trump can win without it. Maybe people will see through this, and you do kind of, at the end of the day, get the government you deserve. If people are going to vote for something that's so clearly like smoke and mirrors and an empty suit, then, at some point you, like I said, you get you deserve, right? But I think that point has not permeated outside of our circles, outside of people who already feel strongly about this race one way or the other. And I think it needs to, whether it's through massive ad buys or a debate or something, but it need that the facts of her record and her statements, the media is clearly not going to bring that up in any of these fluff interviews. Obviously, the Kamala campaign themselves are not going to even try to explain it. I've been shocked is not the right word, but she is she's a very easy liar. Like, even by standards of politicians, she doesn't feel the need to do the kind of dissembling thing that most people do when they're caught in a blatant contradiction to something that they've said just, a couple years prior. She just straight up denies what she said. She reminds me of Gavin Newsom in that way. And so I still think, I don't know what you guys think, but I still think there needs to be some way to push out her actual words, her statements, her policies, which, if nothing else, one, prove where her radicalism lies, but also show her to be a complete liar. And I don't think that's permeated, and I don't think the media is going to allow it to, without Trump or Vance being the ones who end up in debate or elsewhere pushing that into the mainstream consciousness.
Yeah, I agree, Inez, with pretty much everything you said. And kind of the upside of it is, wow, like anybody with any discernment who's just not a total, having been assumed into the Borg at this point, looks at what she is and understands that she is simply an empty vessel for a total state oligarchy, and that she lies without shame and all of these things. So the positive news is, like, we're getting all of those people to shift over. The negative news is that may not be a majority of voters. And I do agree with you that we need to figure out some way to get that message beyond just our folks and into a broader set of the electorate. And it's kind of frightening, quite frankly, that we can't do it, that she is allowed to just like not give interviews. I mean, this is kind of historically unprecedented. Even the soft, media people who are totally in her pocket, she can't give in interviews. So it's really remarkable kind of where we are as a country. It's disturbing. And I do think that we need to shake things up a little bit. To do that, I think Trump has done that a little bit on immigration with the Haitians, that I think sort of I strongly dissent from the people who thought that was ever a bad move. I think it kind of took the conversation into Kamala's record a little bit. But yeah, I mean, we've got to do something to get the truth out about her record in a way that the media will refuse to do.
Well, and yeah, of course, we're dealing with symptoms really here. The root causes of our education system, corporate media, and beyond, all being organs of the regime, makes it hard. Then add on, of course, the social media companies who control the flow of information, the digital public square, and it makes it only more daunting, which is one of the reasons I've harped on it over and over again here and elsewhere. So I don't know what the answer is for how you break through. You would hope that the campaign is presumably figuring out what are the three most important issues to the voters they need in the handful of jurisdictions around the country in the swing states, and hammering home the message, illustrating that Kamala is a radical on those issues, has views that are antithetical to those voters, and has views that are so malevolent that you have to vote like your livelihood depends upon it. And of course, for the Republic, in a lot of ways, it really does, to the extent you think that the regime can do really existential damage over the next 4+ years on top of what it's already done. So there's the question of figuring out the right messaging, then there's figuring out who you target, and then it's figuring out how do you break through when you have all of these sort of systemic roadblocks put up against you. And it's daunting overall. Now, the non-black pill take, which I'll put forth just to switch things up a little bit, is that we saw the New York Times reporting on the fact that the Harris campaign is spending time and focus and energy on Wisconsin. They don't think it's sewn up by any stretch. That's interesting because in the polling, Wisconsin looks better for Harris than many of the other Rust Belt states. There's some analysis out there to show that the Jill Steins of the world and other kind of candidates on the periphery actually who are on the ballot actually can make a substantial difference there, did in 2016, where Jill Stein hurt Hillary Clinton there. Of course, RFK Jr. is still on the ballot there, I believe, as well. So that could potentially serve to Donald Trump's detriment. So we'll see. There's also been empirical data out there showing that voter registration breakdowns by party ID, Republicans have substantially closed gaps that existed versus prior elections. So potentially that's bullish as well. And then obviously a lot of the polls, if you adjust them for how off the pollsters were by design or not in 2016 and 2020, those also look pretty bullish for Donald Trump. So I find it very hard to assess the validity of the polls because they're only as good as the pollsters and the samples. And of course, there are polls that may be aimed to suppress. There may be polls that are aimed to create false impressions about where the race is. It still seems to me like this is a razor thin battle. And the one thing I'd say is the fact that Kamala Harris, her surrogates, wanted to have another debate right after the first debate and then kind of recanted, and now want to do it again. To me, that signals weakness. That does not signal strength. She's engaging in prevent defense, but she's also showing signs that she's not necessarily ahead while engaged in it. Prevent defense, I think, is a losing strategy, even when employed by those who are ahead. But it seems to me like if you were winning, you wouldn't want to have another debate. You would say the science is settled, it's game over, I'm the superior candidate. And the fact they're not doing that and feel they need an additional bump, I do think is telling. But that said, yeah, if it comes down to thousands of votes in a handful of jurisdictions, I say buckle up because the Democrat machine is made to win under those kind of conditions.
Yeah, polls, especially in an environment of political realignment of the last 4 to 8 years, I think should always be read as op-eds. This is not to say that they're have nothing to say to us, but they should always be read as op-eds and not straight news. With that, we're gonna do our fourth segment with Jeremy on some trends among Zoomers and the youths, as we old conservatives would like to say.
Yeah, as a core Gen X guy, I'm always a little nervous about pontificating on Zoomers, but here we have a large survey from the American Enterprise Institute, more than 5,000 people on religious belief, and this is particularly focusing on Christians, but I suspect that if you looked in other religious communities in the US, you might find something similar, which finds among Gen Z, this is a kind of historically unprecedented finding. You have young men being more religiously engaged than young women. And of course, the New York Times has its own liberal take on this and spin that they're doing. And they sort of have this woman that I just tweeted out about, who is allegedly the kind of modal person who left the Southern Baptist Church, and she's got her smash the patriarchy sign, and she's got her Kamala Harris action figure on her desk, and she's got her abortion is healthcare shirt. So there's certainly a message being delivered there. But I do think that sort of more broadly, I mean, there's kind of two trends that I see that are interesting, one bad and one good. The bad one is that I think we see, just as we see these kind of, this extreme vote. I mean, basically every group is sort of pretty strongly Republican in the United States right now, other than young women and particularly young single women. And this is kind of another sort of indication of that. But I think the kind of positive end, and this is where I will become very much of a tradcon, is that this gives an opportunity. The church has really been feminized, and to me, that's a big negative over a number of years, and that has made the church suffer in terms of doctrine, in terms of style, and I actually think in terms of ultimately its level of appeal and ability to lead society for both men and women. And so I think a church with more male leadership, I think, can begin to take stronger views on doctrine. It can ultimately play a stronger role in society. And that I think, again, more broadly, to kind of out my traditionalist sympathies, a space in which men ultimately lead and can show confidence in leading. And we do see some of that in this. It's not just women leading. When men can lead, and can do that, which is something I think they've traditionally in recent years had trouble doing, I think women will follow. And I think that will, I mean, again, speaking broadly, I think that's a very positive trend. So I think that this is kind of a double-edged sword, but it is certainly a really interesting empirical finding that we're seeing.
I'm not all that surprised by this because we have seen this trend among young women, particularly younger millennials and Zoomers, who have been really getting into sort of like crystal, spiritual healing kind of cultish alternatives to religion. They've sort of taken aesthetics to be something that they're really interested in. They unfortunately are sort of drawn to this idea of witchcraft and some of this occultish type stuff as well. And so there have, I think the feminization of churches has actually been a lot in response to that as a means of trying to draw women in. But I do think that women are sort of naturally inclined, as you suggested, Jeremy, to follow strong leaders. And the feminization of churches perhaps has had the opposite of the intended effect, because why would you go to one of these churches if you can accomplish the same thing by having your healing crystals and your tapestry up in your bedroom and doing like your Taylor Swift inspired spells? I do think that the church needs to be willing to provide like a strong arm or strong willed alternative to those sort of impulses. Otherwise, you end up just overlapping with something that's much easier to access and digest through like BuzzFeed listicles.
I can't speak to sort of the internal church dynamics. I'd be the last person to ask on those, but broadly about the sex dynamics in our society, I think that might be overly optimistic. The thing both of you have pointed to, which I think is a real phenomenon, probably a positive one, that women tend to follow men as particularly like a strong and assertive male leaders, not if they're not living their lives alongside of them, right? So what we're seeing more broadly is that, and Jeremy alluded to this, and this is not just a religious, this is very visible in the political statistics, is that married women and women, and I imagine you could conduct a similar study in terms of women with fathers in the household, would probably show even stronger results, that married women tend to vote Republican. They tend to have views that are much closer to those of married men and even of unmarried men, generally in terms of worldview. The women who do not overwhelmingly, and of course there are many exceptions on all these sides, we're talking statistically and a matter of averages, but the women who do not are women who are living their lives apart from men. And you see the same thing with men, by the way. Men develop their own interests and political views when they're not linked with the women in their lives, and they have a tendency to go further right. Now we might agree, the particular four of us, right, might agree more, but there with that demographic than we do with the single women demographic. But there does seem to be a kind of alignment of interests, and it makes sense when you think about it, right? When you think about your life in alignment with the interests of your family as a unit, those interests tend to reflect the needs of both men and women, right, in some kind of compromise. And what we're seeing is that a huge factor of our politics, and I think you're really seeing it in this election, like especially with the way that the Kamala Harris campaign is being rolled out, you are seeing it as a sex-based election. And when men and women don't marry, don't live together in families, don't have intact parents, don't have a father in the home, right, for young women and vice versa, what we're seeing is male and female interests, both in the political sphere and I imagine in the religious and cultural and everywhere else, peeling apart from each other and being oppositional to one another. And that makes, it in some level makes perfect sense, but it's very, very bad for our politics. And that's what I would look at in those numbers from AEI that Jeremy is bringing up as a segment this week. Is it makes sense. I think it's part of a larger trend where you see young men going sharply right as a reaction to the direction, I think, of a generally feminized culture, and young women going still further left. And as both a consequence of that and as its antecedent, so there's a loop going on here. Simply, we're not seeing people form families and live alongside each other in a way that would moderate those sex-based interests, whether politically or personally. So I don't know. I think we're kind of headed the way of South Korea. I think that's really not a good thing across the board. But I wouldn't be surprised if this is one more reflection of it, and that churches become a more male and masculine space as young women shift further left in worldview across the board, and young men shift further right.
I can't prognosticate on where this ultimately goes in terms of the direction of the church and then the knock-on effects for society broadly. But what I would say is, this sort of validates the Democrats', whether it's organic or not, strategy of targeting traditional faith, targeting the family, pursuing policies antithetical to family formation and traditional values, virtues, principles, and of course, faith. Then, my mind also goes to the life of Julia that the Obama administration put forth, showing government as your protector from cradle to grave, particularly targeting women. And obviously, there's an aspect of this, which is that to the extent you target family and you target faith, then the state is sort of the alternative, and you look at it as your key provider, and the state's ideology of progressivism becomes your faith. It's interesting, though, to note that young men seem to be rebelling against it, but I can't fathom it being positive, the divide between the sexes long term. And I guess the question is going to be, is there a tipping point? Is there a point at which the brunt of the left's policies is so heavily borne by a substantial percentage of women who are unfulfilled and unhappy, and they recognize that that is a consequence of the left's policies, that they ultimately rebel against it? Or is the polarization between the sexes just going to accentuate and become greater? And I guess we'll see how that chasm plays out over time. But it can't be good ultimately for our society, let alone our politics.
And with that, we're going to move to final thoughts, and I'll take the moderator's prerogative to kick us off. Just a demonstration of the way that the Republican Party operates as opposed to the Democratic Party, a relatively small one, although it may end up being quite consequential. Nebraska seems like it is hesitant now, the Republican Party in Nebraska, to go to a winner-take-all system on the Electoral College. Apparently, there are quite a few scenarios in which this might actually matter and might hand Donald Trump the presidency. And just as a comparison, I mean, both Biden and Harris have floated court packing schemes. They've floated, she just, I think, proposed that the filibuster should be nuked to codify Roe, right? The standards of Roe. So, and there are an endless number of examples of this. The Republican Party is refusing to use the wholly legitimate political tools at its disposal because it's squeamish about using them in a political way. And I just think that does speak, this relatively small incident, which may end up being consequential, but just speaks volumes about the way that Republicans think about using political power, the way that they are hesitant to use even legitimate political power. To me, it recalls a lot of these debates about how it's supposedly illiberal, quote unquote, to, for example, to set curriculum standards in public schools, as though that were not a totally legitimate, small d democratic and political tool that was used by all sides of the political debate for more than 100 years in the common school system. And then all of a sudden, Republicans basically decided that using it was illegitimate and unilaterally disarmed. And here's another very clear example of that. I can't think of something, honestly, that's like sharper and clearer than just refusing. I don't think it's a totally done deal, but there's some key Republicans who have come out and expressed hesitancy about moving to a winner-takes-all system in Nebraska in terms of allocating those electoral votes. And it just seems like a no-brainer to me. It seems like a no-brainer political tool, and it says a lot about the Republican Party that they're unwilling to use it.
My final thought is literally like two sentences, but we talked, I think, a few weeks on this show about Mark Zuckerberg's sort of political reimagining. He had been using some kind of PR firm to make him more palatable to conservatives or Republicans, and I think we discussed whether or not that was sincere. There's been a minor update to that. He apparently now identifies as a libertarian. So, again, not sure if that's sincere, what exactly it means. Maybe he's just trying to make sure Facebook/Meta are not regulated, regardless of who wins the next election. Maybe this is a signal that he thinks Trump is going to win. But yes, Zuckerberg, the libertarian.
All right, I'll go. I was going to talk about Nebraska as well because it's just so obvious. This wouldn't even be a question. Word of the shoe on the other foot. The Democrats would do anything and everything necessary to take all the electoral votes there. So it's just utterly, I mean, to say they don't know what time it is there is an understatement, I think, ultimately for what's happening on the ground. That aside, on the big tech point, and I'm working on something of a reported piece on this. I think it's worth noting that it appears that Elon Musk is likely going to bow out in the face of pressure from the Brazilian government and comply with essentially its censorship demands against the opposition to the left in that country, Bolsonaro and his supporters as well. This is telling because in terms of the user base, Brazil has around 20 million X users. By contrast, the European Union has over 100 million users, and it is currently probing and scrutinizing X under Digital Services Act, which hasn't been talked about much, but is a massive regulatory regime that forces companies to comply with effectively its content moderation standards and European conceptions, both at the European Union level and within the 27 member states, of quote unquote illegal speech, hate speech, etc., in content moderation. And if a platform like X doesn't comply, it could face crippling fines of 6% of global annual revenue, as well as potentially ultimately being temporarily or I guess potentially permanently banned if it won't comply. This is one regime of many around the world that is operating right now on US-based social media platforms and social media platforms that are ubiquitous among American users. Australia is threatening now 5% fines, I believe, of annual revenues on offending speech on platforms to the extent they don't adequately remedy it. The UK in 2025, under its regime, which of course does not have free speech like we do, 10% of global annual revenue, crippling penalties. So what I would say is this is the global censorship industrial complex coming into sharp relief. And this is a backdoor effort that could very easily, to the extent the platforms cave and change their standards to comply with European and other non-American speech standards, could lead to the imposition of anti-First Amendment speech regulations on the US from the back door via these foreign countries. And that's going to pose a real threat down the road, I think, to anything remotely resembling a free and open digital public square for Americans.
Yeah, my comment will be again on perhaps a theme here, the right just failing to use power effectively. I've got a piece that'll be coming out shortly that looks at the Supreme Court obviously had this decision that came down on affirmative action at universities. We now have the kind of first round of what admissions look like in the wake of that. And at the ones that complied, you still saw, let's be clear, you still have discrimination against white students and Asian Americans happening, but perhaps at least at a politically reasonable level given where we are. But a lot of the bigger platforms or schools rather just didn't comply at all. And I mean, effectively, like there's no reduction in the Black and Hispanic student population in a way that's just not sustainable with any sort of a merit-based approach to admissions. And so they're basically in the kind of proverbial Andrew Jackson, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And my real question is, what is potentially a Trump administration going to do, or the Supreme Court going to do itself, about these universities that are blatantly giving the finger to the Supreme Court and just saying, hey, you know what, we're not going to obey you at all. The one kind of silver lining, although sadly I don't usually think that this is kind of privilege distributed equally, is I think the right can certainly look at what the left is doing on some of these and say, oh, well, that's interesting. I guess we don't really need to follow court orders that we don't like anymore, even if they're from the Supreme Court. I'm not sure that over the long term that actually, I think that actually probably helps us in a lot of jurisdictions. But in any case, it's a big game of chicken that the universities seem intent on playing, and they're basically betting that the Supreme Court and the right will not impose any real consequences for their blatant defiance of the law, and we'll have to see whether that's really the case.
I'm glad you said proverbial there. I thought it's one of my, with my husband being an Andrew Jackson scholar, I think I can fairly call him. He didn't say that.
No, I know. He probably did not say it, but proverbially he did say it, and it's appropriate. You know, it's appropriate for his personality, which is why it stuck around.
Yeah. On that historical note, on behalf of Amber, Ben, and Jeremy, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.